Well, hello, I'm Marianne, and it's really nice to be here and nice of you to come along. I am the author of this book, which is called Zen Under Fire, and I wrote this book after spending 2 years in Afghanistan. I wrote it with a very specific intention, which was I wanted to write about Afghanistan in a way that would be appealing and interesting and accessible to people who maybe otherwise wouldn't read about Afghanistan. I come from New Zealand, and in New Zealand there hadn't been a lot of coverage really of the situation in Afghanistan, despite the fact that New Zealand has had military forces in Afghanistan now for more than a decade. The coverage that we get in the media in New Zealand tends to be either relatively glorified stories about the good work that our soldiers are doing in Afghanistan, kind of publicity for the defence forces, or news coverage of the conflict. And as we all know, news coverage has a focus on crisis and a focus on drama, and tends to isolate pieces of a country and elements of a country's story and tell them in a way which really plays up the drama and the conflict, and doesn't give people a very good sense at all of the whole country or what's going on. And I certainly don't claim that my little book gives a picture of the whole country. That wasn't my objective. What I hoped to do in this book was to tell the story of some of the people who I met and grew to know and worked with in Afghanistan, because one of my concerns when I look at the way that Afghanistan is presented in the media in New Zealand is that there are two strong stereotypical types of Afghans who you see in the New Zealand media. And one is an Afghan male who's predominantly portrayed in the news media in the form of violent or oppressive or corrupt men. I feel like that's really the dominant stereotype, the kind of Afghan man that you will often see represented in the news media around the world. And then the other figure, Afghan figure, who you often see in the news media is women as victim. Afghan women who are, you don't even get to really know who they are. You see them underneath their burqas, and they're represented as characters who don't have a lot of agency or control over their own fate. And so what I hoped to do with this book was to introduce the people who read it to some of the Afghans who I knew and worked with over the course of my time in Afghanistan. And I decided to do it in a way which made it a very difficult book to write, because I decided that the way that I would do it would be by telling my own story as well. I felt that if I wanted to tell the story of some of the Afghan people who I met and worked with, I had to be prepared to tell my own story as well. So this ended up being a very personal book, which made it more difficult to write, made it much more difficult to publish, because it's quite exposing for me. And I'll tell you a bit more about that as we go. From one of the first chapters, early chapters in my book, that'll give you a sense of the kind of perspective that I had when I arrived in Afghanistan. Life in Kabul was challenging. I've struggled to explain to people what it was like. I can describe the physical desolation of the city, the houses with rocket marks in them like gaping wounds, or pockmarked by bullets. I can tell you that in winter, when I first arrived, the streets were a quagmire of cold, slushy mud through which the long-suffering citizens of Kabul picked their way in rubber clogs. I can describe the women, the hems of their dirty, ragged burqas trailing in the mud, who held their babies up to the car window for me to see as they begged for money. But it's difficult to convey the insidious contraction that creeps into a person's body, mind, and heart when she's banned from walking in the streets because of the threat of being kidnapped. It's not the same as the big explosions of fear that I felt in Gaza when the missiles were falling on the city. In Gaza, once the Israeli military helicopters were gone, the city would return to being a place where I felt safe. I could walk the streets of Gaza City alone without any real sense of threat or danger. The risk there came from outside, and although when it came it wreaked havoc, when it left I once again felt at home. In Kabul it was almost impossible to feel at home. The security situation made it dangerous for my Afghan friends and colleagues to welcome foreigners into their homes. I could visit my colleagues from work, but we had to go to some effort to disguise my coming and going so that their neighbours didn't start spreading rumours that they were harbouring Haraji in their house. So when my contract in Kabul ended and I was offered a job as a human rights officer with the United Nations, I was relieved to find out that the job would be in Herat rather than in Kabul. Herat is no walk in the park. In fact, the security risk even there meant that we were forbidden to walk anywhere. But at least there is a park in Herat where local residents can walk, and I could watch them from the window of my car trying to absorb a vicarious sense of freedom. And so that's how I ended up in Herat, which is where this book begins. And I landed in Herat with this new role with the UN, and I'd worked for many, many years with NGOs, and it was quite a significant decision for me to take on a job with the UN, and I had some sense of the kind of changes in my life that it would involve. I would no longer be able to live in the kind of shared home that I had lived in Kabul. I would no longer be able to move freely in and out of the homes of my Afghan colleagues. I would no longer be able to travel in their cars. So it was quite a big change, and the reason that I agreed to or decided to make those changes was because I had a sense at that time, and this was in 2006, that there really was a possibility for the United Nations mission in Afghanistan to be a meaningful and useful partner to the institutions of the Afghan state in establishing stability, particularly in the justice sector. And I really had quite high, and I realise now in retrospect, idealistic ideas about what might be possible in a human rights role with the UN mission. One of the things that I was particularly interested in was the capacity for the UN mission to support the independent Afghan Human Rights Commission. So that's really where I arrived in Herat, with that hope that I would be able to support the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, and that I would be able to work with local human rights advocates in a way that added more influence to their work and their engagement, particularly with the international community. I think I wanted people who read my book to understand that just because somebody lives in remote rural Afghanistan, just because he's never been to university, just because, quite frankly, he had never even read a copy of the laws of Afghanistan, because he didn't have a copy of the laws of Afghanistan in his office. It doesn't mean that these people are ignorant, or that they are that they don't have an appetite for protecting and promoting the rights of their community and of people in their community. And I really feel that that's a side of Afghanistan that is very rarely represented in the media. And even in Kabul, when I was in Kabul, I found that a lot of quite sophisticated, well-educated, urban Afghans have quite strong stereotypes about the kind of Afghans who live in remote and rural Afghanistan. So I even wanted to share some of these stories, not just because people in New Zealand have stereotypes, but even I found in Afghanistan there were those kind of stereotypes. Anyway, I could talk for a long time, but I wanted to have time for some questions. As I said, this is a very personal book. I tell the story of Afghanistan as I experienced it through my journey in Afghanistan, and as a result, it's quite an exposing book. It tells about that period that I talked about when my mental health was probably not entirely stable, and I talk about things that I was, to be honest, not really looking forward to my grandmother reading the book, but she did, and she seems to still like me, so that's good. But I felt like that was important, because if I wanted to tell anybody else's story, I felt like I had to be willing to tell my own story first, because it seems like it's too easy to go somewhere and tell other people's stories, and I felt I had to earn that right by being willing to include my own experiences, my own stories, and exposing a little bit my own weaknesses and flaws, which I think this book does quite well. So I guess I'm just interested in if anybody has any questions or any comments, or yeah.